This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the third week of November 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Thank you so much for joining us on another live episode of The Beat. We apologize for missing last week. It was UFC 180 Fight Week. We're back this week, and of course, much to discuss. Joining us, as always, Luke Thomas from the SiriusXM Fight Club and MMAfighting.com. From FoxSports.com for now, that is Mark Ramundi. And from SportsIllustrated.com, that is Jeff Wagenheim at the end of the table. So I say for now, Mark, we talk about journalism on this show, so it seems apropos to mention that come next week, you will be officially a member of Team MMAfighting.com. This has to be the biggest moment of your life, right?
Sure. It's also the biggest announcement in MMA this week since the UFC did not quite
Yes, we actually delivered on
Monday. We delivered on an announcement. Yeah, my last day with Fox Sports is tomorrow, and I'll be starting MMAfighting.com on Saturday for
Look at you.
UFC Fight Night in Austin.
They're hiring some real morons at that site now.
Congratulations. Really looking forward to working with you. I can't speak for Luke.
Can't
No,
wait.
of course, it's wonderful. It's cool.
I'm excited.
But in my opinion, one of the very best in the business, so very thrilled to have Mark joining us in just a matter of days. Hope you'll welcome him.
Is actually going to be Luke's personal beard trimmer. That's
Wow.
actually going to be my role.
Don't you touch this thing.
Well, it's
Something
great.
like that. I mean-
Great news. Jeff, anything you want to add about this big news?
I'm just so excited.
Yes, you seem almost speechless.
I'm actually going to start reading your website now.
Yeah, great to have
And
you guys.
Xerxes just made the best team even better.
Yes.
I believe that.
I agree as well. Welcome, Mark. Great to have
Thanks,
you
guys.
on board, and great to have you on the show again this week. All right, guys, let's talk about MMA. Saturday night was a very interesting night for World Series of Fighting, Bellator, and the UFC. All three of them, for the first time ever, had a show going on at the same time, and it was almost like they were in unison because one fight would end here, the next fight would go on. It was pretty amazing to keep up with and witness. But let's talk about Bellator first, because that may have been the big story of them all. Getting over 2 million viewers for the main event, you know, an average of over, and now with DVR, which I know you're a big fan of, Luke, 1.4
It counts for
average.
UFC and Bellator content.
Absolutely. So this was a home run. Highest viewed cable event of the year, highest for Bellator. It seemed like a great crowd. Did this surprise you? At the end of the day, did these numbers surprise you?
I think they did. I think they really did. I'd like to say that I didn't think it'd be not successful. I thought they would produce numbers equivalent to what they had done when that initial Rampage Tito fight fell out and they moved it to Bellator, or they moved it to Spike, and it had done about 1.4 million. I thought it would be around that it climbed as high as it did throughout the broadcast, that it reached these heights, I thought was kind of incredible. Watching the show after the fact, I suppose, is not a surprise. The major takeaway for me, though, about that was you really have to leave the MMA bubble a lot of times. And I got a taste of it at Bellator 120, which is to say, if you just learned about Tito Ortiz from reading Fox Sports or Sports Illustrated or MMA Fighting, not that I say we bash the guy, but if you just read MMA media, Tito Ortiz sounds like the worst person in the world who's dumber than a stump and is horrible to everyone around him. And then you go to shows, and as Dave Doyle pointed out at this show, they were chanting Tito's name, Tito, 10 minutes after it ended, which is exactly what happened when he beat Shlemenko at Bellator 120. I'm not saying that Dana White went on a PR campaign against Tito Ortiz, but he didn't like him. He said a lot of negative things about him. Fans believed it, for better or for worse, and I'm sure he believes the things he said. But there's a huge portion of people who never bought into it, who still want to see Tito Ortiz compete. They sold him on a rivalry against someone else they knew, and everyone responded. It is proof that there is a complete disconnect between casuals and hardcores on Tito Ortiz.
It's a great point, by the way, and also Dave Doyle nailed it even before the event when a lot of people were still criticizing the decision to put Tito versus Bonner in the main event. Clearly, with the number peaking above 2 million, that was the right call. So now,
Right.
Is this the way Bellator should go? Should they just look at this and duplicate and replicate this model for every show, or is this a special thing because you had Tito and Bonner fighting, and we all know what they've done in their careers?
Yeah, it's a special thing, but they still have those guys, and they can still trot them out on certain occasions. When I knew that Bellator was going to be a success on Saturdays when we were in Mexico City, and I'm like tweeting about UFC 180, and my entire Twitter timeline is about Bellator and Joe Schilling's knockout, and I'm like, wow, this is really like, that's when I knew it was going to be a big deal. And I think that it was a great night for Bellator, and I think they showed some balls by going up against UFC on pay-per-view with a live TV show. And what is that Rogan saying that they loop over and over on commercials?
Oh!
Besides that, perfect time for this fight. I think this is the perfect time for Bellator to go right at the UFC. With the UFC in a little bit of a decline, I think competition is good. I'm excited about it.
We also have to remember that one of the biggest factors in the success of Bellator that night has to be the demise of Cain Velasquez's knee. You know, I mean, his knee injury changed the narrative completely. You know, I told you guys before that I did not watch Bellator or the World Series of Fighting live. I was invited to one of the movie theaters. There were 400 theaters that were showing the UFC pay-per-view, and I went there figuring I got invited, so I showed up to that, and I got there a little bit late, just as it was about to start. And I went to the box office and said, do you still have my ticket here? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, we can take care of you. I went into the theater. There was one person sitting inside the theater. One person. Now, there was a second person who had gone down because there was some technical difficulty with sound. He'd gone and found the projector guy. And so then there were 2 people. And then I became the third, and I think a 4th person. By the time the main event happened, there were 4 of us sitting in a vast theater. Now, that was a bit of a letdown, of course, if you're a UFC fan. For me, it was actually good because I would not have been sitting there on my Twitter in a crowded movie theater, but I felt sort of at ease sitting there and following the Bellator as you were. I was pretty amazed that Bellator was all over the Twitter timeline. It was almost like Bellator's night, and it wasn't until I got home later on and saw the way they put on their show and all that kind of stuff that really convinced me that this was why it was the case. But yeah, it was sort of a downer for the UFC not having their big guy there, the baddest man on the planet.
2 fortuitous things happened for Bellator that just lucked out their way. One, obviously, that they had scheduled this event long while Cain Velasquez was still scheduled to compete, I believe, and then he fell out, and so a lot of fans wound up having a choice just by accident: Fabricio Werdum versus Mark Hunt for $60 or $55 or whatever it is, versus Bellator for free. And so that changed the equation a little bit. But also I feel like that in addition to sort of that change happening, I think a lot of fans were just sort of like, let's sort of see what Scott Coker can do here. All right, everyone was telling us this is the new Bellator. This is the first time you're going to see it. And so people wanted to like turn their heads and take a look. And when they saw it, it was like eye-poppingly different. I mean, the show popped out with the huge screens like that.
Yeah.
So I think it was a curiosity by Scott Coker, and then there's just sort of this fortuitous thing about Cain Velasquez dropping out and making the choice between pay-per-view and non-pay-per-view a little bit easier to make.
And where they also succeeded was that when they got people into the fights, people were watching, they put on their best possible presentation. The video boards and like the graphics were all new and they all looked good, and it felt like a big show. And maybe the Tito Bonner fight wasn't the greatest fight, but people know Tito Ortiz. The other fights are pretty good. Chandler Brooks was good. Schilling's KO was one of the big highlights of the entire night. So when they got the viewers in, they sold them. I think people are going to come back to Bellator after seeing that show too.
I mean, I think that's what the big question is going to be, really, because this was a home run for Bellator, but we've seen, if you're a baseball fan, you've seen guys come up, rookies hit a home run in their first at bat or their first game, and everybody gets all excited about them in April, and then by the end of the season, they've sort of faded away. And this was an opportunity for people to see what Scott Coker has. And as opposed to the UFC, which sort of rolls along, the same thing. They finish UFC 180. Well, now they'll get ready for UFC 181 and all the stuff in between, and then 182. It's just like the train rolls on for the UFC. Whereas Bellator is trying to reinvent itself and did so very successfully last Saturday night. And now let's see, the next time that they have a fight card, are they going to still be able to carry that on? Are they still going to be, is it just a novelty, or is this a change in maybe the way people are going to view the stuff?
I do think it's a bit of a high watermark. Other quick thing is, the UFC pay-per-view ended, and Bellator is still going. Yeah. I think a lot of fans had the opportunity to go and check it out.
This may sound a little smug, but what it really taught me was, honestly, this isn't that hard. I mean, promoting isn't that hard. Putting on events isn't that hard. Of course, you have to listen. What I'm trying to say is, if you put on a show once a month, once every 2 months, and you put the best fights possible with the biggest names possible, and you invest in those kinds of resources that they've invested in, people are going to come out. But if you put on a show once a week for 13 straight weeks, with a bunch of bums, and say these are tournaments and it's a tough, no one's going to care. At the end of the day, you have to get people to care. You have to give yourself time to promote these events, and they did that. They've been promoting Tito Bonner since before that last season started. They had it on the cages, they had commercials, they put out ancillary programming, all this stuff. It's promotion, and it's one of the things that I think plagues the UFC these days. They look at this card in Austin. This is actually a very good card.
Quality is not the issue.
But there's no time. We only have, come Monday, maybe Tuesday, you know, Monday you're still kind of taking in the event on Saturday. Come Tuesday, we could start to think about Saturday. There's no time to promote these events. That's a problem. It's a problem that has plagued WWE. It's a problem that has plagued the UFC. And of course, it plagued Bellator. Now all of a sudden they have time. We know what the next Bellator event is. It's coming up in January. It's Strauss versus Pitbull. We know that, and then we know there's British Invasion. Now we can get some time to actually digest these things. They weren't doing that, and it was asinine, and it never made any sense.
Two points. I'm actually glad that we have UFC doing what they do. UFC has a vision for good or for worse, and they're going to stick to it. Quality. This is where the best fight the best. We're going to go international, and so we're going to have these, you know, frankly, nubs prelim cards for the most part when they go international. That's the truth. But they're going to have the 3 fights for UFC 180, sensational, above reproach, right? Okay, fine. And Bellator is going to go in the exact opposite direction, and it was in Dave Meltzer's article. They were saying, we're not intending on promoting a fight in a week. We're intending on doing it month after month after month. That's cool. But I would say this, as a word of caution, you said it's not that hard. Maybe so, maybe to get eyeballs. But I don't think they made money on that show on Saturday. They didn't have 10,000 people in that arena at all. I think they had sold less than half that. And I think they can build towards profitability. Don't get me wrong, I think Spike's, they're making the right move. But they're going to have to invest a lot of money. That production didn't come cheap, and so this is a process, not an automatic sort of awakening.
But to me, that was Bellator 1. You know, right now, we're all MMA guys, right? We watch it every single week. What happened Bellator 64? What happened Bellator 78? What happened Bellator 97? We don't know. They all blended together. They all meant nothing. This was the beginning of a brand new promotion. So did you really expect them to sell out in their first event?
Well, they had sold well.
They did so well, but they didn't sell out.
No, they didn't sell out.
They maybe didn't make a profit.
Right.
That's asking a lot. But my point is, they're on the right path here, and they were going somewhere. They're going to Nowheresville before.
This is my point. Was when I saw I'll quickly make the point. Was when I saw the to your point, when you saw like the Mike the Marine Richmond entrance, and they had the helicopters, and I was like, oh my God! And now you watch that and you go, what was Bjorn Rebney thinking? That they could get this doing tournaments in Thackerville, Oklahoma? It made no sense.
It made no sense.
And also the same point that you made about the UFC machine and how it's week by week is that every event blends together. Like you were saying about the old Bellator events. Now it's just like, well, UFC 180, now it's UFC Fight Night Austin. What's the difference? You know, one's on pay-per-view and one's on Fox Sports 1. There's a Fight Pass card coming up. It's all like, you know.
At the end of the day, people need to be emotionally invested. They need to be chomping at. It's like even Pacquiao Algieri. It's not the biggest card. It probably won't do well on pay-per-view because it's in Macau and all these factors, and it's not the big. But I've been hearing about Pacquiao Algieri for months now. I've been hearing it for at least 8 weeks, 9 weeks. At least I know that it's coming up on November 22nd. It's already ingrained. These other fights, just okay, who's fighting? Okay, great. You look at it every week.
I don't know that I would say you have to be emotionally invested in it to a great extent. I mean, Saturday night, if we're not counting the pay-per-view portion where that was hardcore fans are dropping the $55 to watch it, but the Fox Sports 1 UFC fights, the Spike stuff, and then the World Series of Fighting, all on regular cable. Obviously, if they're attracting big numbers, they're getting people who are casual, who are just sports fans, and the way Bellator presented itself, it was really a slick production, and it might just hook in those people who were just sports fans, and they saw it, and they may not know the difference between the level of fighters on the UFC card versus the level of fighters on the Bellator card, but they're seeing a production that looks inviting, and I think it might attract more of those sort of casual, regular old sports fans, because really, we are in a bubble here. The vast majority of people out there who are sports fans don't pay a lot of attention to this sport. And this is a way to sort of get maybe just crumbs, getting a few of them here and there, but that adds up.
And people still look for MMA on Spike TV. It's still like a destination for MMA fans. There are people who still think UFC is on Spike TV, like the really, really like casual fans. So I think some of those people watch Bellator too, and like Jeff said, they don't know the difference. They think this is like the premier organization.
It's also important to note that all that glitters is not gold here. It's an uphill climb for them. They have a lot going against them. We're in a market now where there's a lot of UFC, so it's going to be hard to get people to go off track, and it's going to cost them a lot of money if they want to try to get big stars to come over. It's going to cost them a pretty penny. So there's a lot going against them. I mean, we can't say that this is a big success right off the bat.
I looked at StubHub before I got here. There were only 92 tickets left for the UFC Fight Night 57.
Yeah.
So they did really well at the gate in Austin.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, one of the things that I always find funny when we talk about promotions versus other promotions, like I think a lot of other people take it a lot more personally than we do. I think as MMA journalists, we're trying to, as objectively as possible, I'm looking at Bellator, seeing what they did, okay, and that's it, and then you look at World Series of Fighting and UFC. My point is, they have a lot going against them because I view them now essentially as a startup. But if they can continue to do this and kind of cater to this notion that people like something different from time to time, a different product, an underdog and whatnot, I really think that they could be onto something, but it's not going to happen. I really think we can only, really truly give them a report card in like 2017. We'll only truly know Scott Coker's impact on this company in around 2 or so years. Right now, it's too soon. One event is fine. Even the next event, the current, not current, Strauss Pitbull event, that's not even going to have the ramp. The ramp's only going to be there 4 times a year. Right. So let's not forget that that's going to kind of look like the old Bellator. So it's not going to be but they did a good job of coming out with their best foot forward. I thought that was a pretty good night for them overall.
There's no way to deny it. I mean, I don't know how you watched that Bellator show and was like, well, that sucked.
Yeah.
Maybe the main event.
Right.
But even that no one's mentioned it. How about a NAM fan and Mike Richmond? Great start to the whole thing.
Okay, well, you mentioned the main event. Was that obviously it wasn't a mistake? But should they try to do that again? Meaning, put those featured fights with the legends above a title fight. The purists didn't like that, right?
Yeah, you know what's funny, man? And again, you had to be Bellator 120 because obviously Shlemenko was just totally outsized, and so whatever. Dude, when they announced under Bjorn Rebney, and partly it was just sort of the toxicity of Rebney and the old Bellator regime, people were like, oh my God, Tito Rampage, and maybe it would have done better than we thought it would have, but I still think there was a general ugh about it. Tito Ortiz has somehow rehabilitated his image. It is kind of incredible. Again, maybe the hardcore.
It's one of the stories of the year.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That win over Shlemenko was sort of a gimme when you look at it in retrospect, but it worked. And I thought he looked, for as bad as he looked, I thought he looked way better than Stephan Bonner, who just looked not even ready at all to be competing more. And now all of a sudden,
retired or something.
Yeah. And now all of a sudden you're like, you know what? Tito versus Rampage. I'm not saying it's the worst fight imaginable. It's sort of crazy how he's made another turnaround.
Would you do that, or would you do Tito versus King Mo, which seems to be the other fight that they're flirting with?
Does Rampage want to stay in Bellator? That's the big question.
Well, that is a big question.
Tito Rampage still. I mean, I still think those are the 2 biggest names they have.
Does Bellator need Rampage? He seems to be a little unhappy with them and now tweeting about the UFC and kind of regretting his decision, right?
But if he were to be able to go back to the UFC, what is there for him really? I think
there's a lot there for him.
I don't think he's not going to go anywhere at the UFC. He's just at least in Bellator, he can be a headline guy. He can be a guy who is the.
You don't think he can headline in this day and age with the UFC doing 45 events?
He can act. Dude, someone called into my radio, the Sirius XM Fight Club, and made a great point. What about giving him versus Shogun as a fight?
Sure.
Not the worst fight at all by any stretch of the imagination. Because you don't want to if Shogun's going to retire, who are you going to give him? Somebody who's just a no-name at the bottom of the list, and maybe that guy beats him, but it just seems so unceremonious to cast a guy out that way. At least give Rampage a chance to.
I'm not that down on Rampage right now. I know he lost to Glover. He didn't get knocked out.
Another guy who's, say what you want about the competitive schedule he's had in Bellator, but also been winning. That counts.
The light heavyweight division in the UFC is not very good outside of the top 3 or 4 guys. Rampage can absolutely win fights in that division, 100%.
Like Rampage OSP, not the worst fight in the world.
No, not the worst.
No, certainly not.
Yeah.
So
how about even Rampage at heavyweight?
But
he spoke about it, before he started. He spoke about it in his press conference with Bellator when he was introduced. Fight at heavyweight. The heavyweight division is kind of lean in the UFC too.
I just think he fits better in the vision of what Bellator is trying to do, which is to fill the cards with whatever they've got, and then at the top of the card put recognizable name against recognizable name, notwithstanding their birth dates. They might be old, over the hill, whatever, but Tito Ortiz, Stephan Bonner, drew, what was the number? 2.something?
2.246 million.
I mean, come on, that is what they're trying to do. So take advantage of having Rampage. Bring over anybody else that the UFC
they need those
drops.
Guys. That's right. You're 100% right.
Maybe that's why the UFC might want to bring him back. Well, he does kind of fit in with.
Well, Dana White said on Off the Record on TSN in Canada that the relationship isn't as bad as we may think. He does have a contract. He has multiple fights left on that contract, so it's not like he could just walk away. But it's something that's interesting to monitor. What did you guys think of the night overall? Did you like having all those events at the same time? To me, it was fun for one night, but it was almost dizzying. I prefer if Bellator was on a different night so I could watch that event in World Series of Fighting. You know what I mean? It felt like a little too much. Once a year, cool. But I almost feel like it's counterproductive. Maybe I'm wrong in being selfish because the ratings would say otherwise. but it didn't. I don't know. I felt like I was missing out when I would prefer to watch everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to tell what made less of an impact: World Series of Poker or World Series of Fighting. If you want something to not get viewed, just put World Series of in front of it. Like, don't do that. World Series of MMA Beat, the ratings would tank, man.
Would make no sense.
Yeah.
Also.
Well, like World Series of Fighting makes sense.
no
What does that
sense.
even mean?
Yeah, it doesn't
mean anything. Not that the show was bad, just whatever. But listen, here's my thought. MMA is a crazy sport where crazy things happen. I couldn't do it if it was a regular occurrence where it was all these things going on. But for one night on one day of the calendar, yeah, it was kind of fun. It was kind of crazy and unpredictable and hard to follow, and that made it interesting.
Who's the big winner on Saturday?
I think Bellator was.
One guy in particular?
One fighter on the Bellator card.
No, just of the
Scott
night.
Coker.
Scott Coker,
I think, was the big winner. I think that Bellator probably won the night. I mean, the ratings were great. They outdid UFC. Obviously, you have to pay for UFC, and Bellator was for free. But I think Bellator, they're reborn, and I think they're on the right track. And I think World Series of Fighting, like Luke said, I think Bellator, it was a good decision to go head-to-head with the UFC, and it worked out in their favor because Cain Velasquez dropped out, and they ended up, being the big winner. World Series of Fighting, they had good fights on that card, and no one was taught. Gaethje Gillard was a really good fight.
Right.
That got some buzz.
Got a little bit of buzz,
Yeah.
but imagine how much it could have gotten
that's
on another
unfortunate.
weekend.
They should not be in that game.
No.
They should try to
No.
avoid that. The next big Bellator event, by the way, is on a Friday. They're not going head-to-head with UFC
Right.
184, so it doesn't seem like they're going to try to make a habit out of this. Maybe these
those
ratings...
4 times a year, though, they'll do that.
No, that's
when
the
they're
next
on
big one.
Saturdays, they're going. I know.
Yeah.
Oh, it's gonna be on Friday.
That's on Friday,
Okay.
February 27th.
Although they said that the big ones are going to be on Saturdays.
The tent pole, the quarterly ones.
The quarterly
No, but
ones.
February 27th is on a Friday.
Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, in general, I think they want to go on
Perhaps you
Saturday.
guys should look at the schedule before doing this show.
This is true.
I only
Maybe
watched-
some research would be a good idea.
Yeah.
I only watched 12 of the 34 fights that night. I went back later on. Of course, now I had the disadvantage or advantage or whatever being in a theater and not being able to flip back and forth.
Did you feel like a doofus being there alone?
Actually, I always go out alone.
Okay.
It's just, I sit in movie theaters by myself, usually seeing these
That
really
sounds about
crazy
right.
artsy films that nobody else will see.
Artsy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Another word for
exactly.
pornography. I'm just kidding.
Exactly. But I actually thought that Will Brooks was kind of a, when I got home and watched that fight, because I don't know, I think that the perception was a little bit that it was a little bit of a mirage the first time he beat Chandler. He won the fights. Some people thought Chandler won. There was a lot of the aftermath was about, well, that sort of ruined the Chandler Alvarez thing, and Brooks was sort of out by the wayside. But man, he had a hell of a performance, and so he might have been the guy.
Very quickly, I thought I had more fun watching the Bellator show, but the winner of the night is Fabricio Werdum.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not going to deny the guy that. Everyone talked about the redemption story of Mark Hunt. The fact of the matter is, this was a guy in Werdum that had been handed his walking papers out of the UFC and had to climb his way back. And at the same moment, his skill set came together. So did many career opportunities, which he took off and ran with. Couldn't be happy for the guy. Wins by flying knee and is an Abu Dhabi and Mundial champion. What a guy! What a night for him.
I don't know that I would agree with this because my disagreement would be in the form of a question. Do you think before that fight started, as opposed to after that fight started, in what scenario did you think that Werdum has a better chance against Velasquez? Do you think he had a better chance against Velasquez, viewing him before he fought Hunt or after?
I don't really view it as a function of Velasquez's absence or presence. I view it as a function of his own ability and accomplishment. Right? Let's pretend a world where Velasquez doesn't exist for just a moment. If you just look at his steady climb and the way in which when he returned to the UFC, beat guys. He didn't beat Roy Nelson with an arm triangle. He beat him up in the clinch badly, right? Never once had to use his ground skills. And then so when he gets to a point where he's fighting Mark Hunt, and he got rocked by Mark Hunt, comes back with a flying knee KO. Dana White was totally right. You rarely see that. It's just, listen, there are guys in the game that sometimes they give everything they have. Guys like Matt Brown and guys like Kenny Florian, and they just work on their craft and they work on their craft. And after a while, you're like, my God, this one-sided guy, this one-trick pony, he is not a one-trick pony anymore. He's incredible. And Werdum was always a guy who had some strong pedigree. I get it. He was a world champion in jiu-jitsu. But now he is doing things that you just don't see heavyweights in their prime do, and he's doing it with aplomb. And for a guy who was set in his walking papers to come back and win in the way he did, and was a hero. You could tell me this, was a hero for the Mexican crowd. How do you deny him this moment, man?
Also,
I just don't see it.
We tend to forget now, but even leading up to the Fedor fight, he wasn't viewed the same way that he is today. He was just a UFC cast-off. Like, we were thinking, like, Fedor's going to fight Werdum.
He looked bad against Mike Kyle. He got rocked. He got rocked against
Right.
Antonio Silva and had to come back in those fights. That, to me, is incredible.
Well, he sort of had to come back. I mean, I feel like he won 5 seconds of that fight. I mean, until that until that knee
all that
connected,
counts.
it was Hunt's fight. You know, the whole first round was Hunt's, and up to that point, the second round was Hunt's. And then he lands. You can't take that away from him. You can't deny him his moment. And I will say this: when he won, the childlike joy on his face at the end of it, I thought was really beautiful. And the way he came over to Hunt, and the two of them kind of like talked to each other a little bit. I thought that was really great, and I felt really good about what happened for him. I guess my point was that I felt like that seeing the way Hunt fought him made me think that when Velasquez gets his hands on him, it's going to be a slaughter.
I think, and I said it on the post-fight show on Saturday night in Mexico City. I know I changed my answer and I said Coker was the big star of the night, but to Luke's point, Werdum, from another perspective, the way that he engaged with the fans and the media last week in Mexico was really a different kind of Werdum than we've seen in the past. And he was so charismatic and so outgoing. And if they do put that fight in Mexico City against Velasquez, and I think they're gonna put it in Mexico, maybe not Mexico City, Werdum is going to have might have just as many fans as Velasquez, because he really carried that card. He took the ball when Velasquez went out, and he became the face of UFC 180. And the fans and the media were going crazy for him. I mean, he had an entourage around him of media all week. I mean, obviously it helps that he speaks the language, but he's actually becoming like a little bit of a star in Mexico.
Well, it proves that there are different ways to promote, right? Going back to my earlier point, you don't have to do the Conor way. You don't have to do the Chael way. You could be a fun-loving, open guy, play to the crowd, joke, play music. There are different ways, but you have to try. You know, you can't just sit there, answer some questions in a scrum and think that you're doing your job.
He called us cabrones.
Yes, you love that. Guys, let's switch gears. Let's switch gears, because one of the fun things about MMA is that there's never a time off, right? It keeps going and going and going. There are no days off. You love this in particular.
Oh, my favorite thing
and
about the job.
It was so busy on Saturday, we didn't even have a chance to catch our breath, because on Monday, we had this big UFC press conference. And they were going to announce their schedule, they were going to bring out all these big fights, and they were going to make a special announcement. And this was really what was capturing everyone's imagination. What was this announcement going to be? You were there. You were in Las Vegas. First question asked to Dana White.
Yes.
They brought out everyone. Chris Weidman, Vitor Belfort, Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor. Everyone was there. Spider Silva, Nick Diaz, the list goes on and on. The biggest names in the UFC. First question to Dana White, what's the announcement? We didn't get done in time. What was it like being there? What was the atmosphere like after he said there would be no announcement?
What was the hashtag? The waste of time is now? Is that what it was?
No,
I'm just kidding. The time is now. Of course, I'm just joking. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like the energy got sucked out of the room.
Did you feel it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was almost like, well, now what are we gonna ask him about? I think everyone was, all the media there was kind of primed to ask many follow-up questions about whatever this announcement was going to be, and then there was no announcement, and you could almost, when you were watching the broadcast, you could see that not a lot of reporters were raising their hands to ask questions, and I think that was because everyone was kind of shocked. Like, everyone already had like their questions that they were going to ask about the big announcement, and then it didn't happen, and everyone was like, well, now what do we ask?
So was this a huge blunder by the UFC? I mean, could they have done things differently? I have my 2 cents on it, but what do you think?
On the one hand, I've always been a big proponent of them putting their star power to effective use. I think having a red carpet and
it was nice.
this nice theater and everyone there. I mean, that stage, you looked at the stage, you were like, you don't really see. I mean, remember at the GSP fight, and they had the pre-fight press conference. They had all the champions sit there together. That was a moment, right? You're looking at it like, wow, that's like a Hall of Fame in front of you in some ways, you know. And I felt that same kind of thing. So I thought that the intent was there. How do you schedule a press conference and you don't have things done? And I know that they were saying, well, the PR side of the company went and got ahead of themselves. I don't buy that for 2 seconds. I don't know if there's been miscommunication or what, but I don't think that they had a graphic ready, and they said, not only are we going to go on November 17th, we're going to give you another teaser on November 5th, because they announced all the way back in October, I believe, and then they don't have anything ready. It's an unforgivable blunder.
The simple solution, in my opinion, would have been, even if it's 30 minutes before or an hour before, send an email out to all those media members on your mailing list and just say, look, unfortunately, we promised this, it's not going to happen, so don't even bother asking a question. I mean, you may want to ask what happened, this and that, but don't ask what it is, because we didn't get it done in time. But to just announce it on the spot there, to me felt like.
Well, it didn't get announced on the spot. That was even if they had walked out on stage. I know it was not Dana White at first. It was John Anik came out on stage.
Sure.
If his first words out of his mouth were, I know just what you said. I know we plan to make an announcement. We're not going to get this together on time. But we've got these fighters here, and here we go. That would have been fine. But it was almost as though they were trying to sort of pretend that they'd never made that promise, and they're just going to go along. And if that person had not asked that question, now it was interesting. It was the first question. What if nobody had got around to it until much later? They would have just gone through this whole press conference without ever acknowledging that they were not that the whole purpose that they were there.
I don't know if it was the whole purpose, because that wasn't really the lead when you read the press release.
Yeah, but how do you tease a huge announcement?
A very special was.
I mean, what do you like? What you just there's no way that a public relations professional signed off on the fact that they didn't have anything ready to go, and they said, well, let's go ahead and do this. I don't know what happened last minute. Something fell through, but it is like PR 101. You don't schedule anything until it's done.
Well, that's the unfortunate thing in all this, because as you guys mentioned, I mean, to have all those champions up there and those names, that's an event in itself.
Sure,
like, if they never would have put that out there.
And it was good for media. Media got lots of stuff to talk about.
Before and after. If they never would have put that out there, this would have been a fine event. I mean, this would have been it looked great. Anik did a great job as MC. It felt big.
It did.
And also, it was doing what we have criticized them. In fact, on this show alone, they were looking ahead. They were telling you, this is what's coming up. Forget about the schedule for a second. This is what's coming up with these fights and these locations for the next 2 months. This is what we've wanted them to do. So that was the unfortunate thing. It kind of took away from what was otherwise, I thought, a very good event for the UFC.
Well, on a positive note, after the actual televised portion of the press conference was over, they brought every single one of the fighters into like a back room, and every reporter there pretty much got time, almost in a one-on-one setting with the biggest fighters in the sport, and that was really kind of an unprecedented thing. So aside from kind of not delivering on that big announcement, for me and for the media, I know that you guys probably don't care that much, but for the media it was a huge success because you got a chance to talk to Ronda Rousey, not on fight week, not trying to cut weight.
Big difference.
A huge difference. Not with 5 PR people around her. Same thing, Chris Weidman, and it was the most open that any of them I think have ever been. Even Anderson Silva, he did most of it in Portuguese, his scrum, but the Brazilian media told me that he was the most open that he's possibly ever been with the media. And it was just a relaxed setting, and it was from a media perspective, from a reporter standpoint, it was great. I'm sure that it was a letdown to the fans, but from a selfish level, I thought it was good.
I mean, that's a really good thing. I don't know, but I'm probably not alone in thinking that, or expecting on that morning when that thing was going to start, that this big special announcement was going to be underwhelming. I mean, I was preparing myself for this to be something about the UFC uniforms, or something that was going to be not a thing that was going to be earth-shattering. I mean, I'm sure there were folks who were like, oh, it's going to be like the return of Brock Lesnar or something really huge. But I was expecting something small. I'm surprised they didn't just pull something out that was small and say, here's our announcement.
They did, the Tarek Saffiedine fight.
But I mean, and actually try to frame that as being their.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that would have been a little bit of a. That would have been a little.
Now to announce Tarek Saffiedine the next fight.
Okay, so then the other thing, they didn't make that announcement. They did put out those big fights. We knew about the fights already, but it was good to see them all. The face-offs were cool, right? Mm-hmm. But they put out the schedule. They didn't tell us where exactly these fights would take place. As expected, we talked about this on the show, but they gave you the dates. And, other than the fact that now we know when we'll be working and, where, what pay-per-view will be, or what date will be UFC 189, it told us that they're pretty much doing the same amount of events next year. And this has been a year that's been criticized for too many events. What did you guys think of the schedule? Any takeaway from just seeing those dates?
Surprising to me. Very surprising to me because, you had that report yesterday from Bloomberg saying that their revenue was going to be down, profit was going to be down 40% this year. Now, a lot of that is due to injury, there's no doubt about it. But when you look at MMA, you don't think that MMA injuries are going to decline overnight. Like, these are just not going to have any more. That schedule they have is like, if you account for 0 injuries, not affecting a single fight, even then you're going to have, I think, problems selling on pay-per-view. And they still have 13 pay-per-views. And people say, well, what about just lowering the number of pay-per-views, but then having the same number of fight nights? Sorry, gang, the two are related. If you have a huge amount of fight nights, that means you have to staff those with main events and co-main events, which can't then go to pay-per-view, which they say they're not a pay-per-view company anymore, and it's true. But boy, it's still a big component. And when you have that much trouble on pay-per-view, and you didn't learn anything from 2014 by having the exact same, more than one a month pay-per-view, listen, I just feel like this whole global expansion thing is like is a thought experiment. Like, hey, could we prove that we could go global and put on shows in Sweden and New Zealand and Mexico and then have them be locally successful? And the answer is largely yes, but it comes with so many other consequences. I really, really, really don't get the idea that you could, or the argument that you can go and take this thing global. I just don't see it.
I mean, were injuries a big problem this year? Yeah, of course, but is it injuries or the combination of injuries and just doing too many cards? There's always been injuries in MMA. There's always been guys dropping out of main events, but previously they were able to patch things up and actually put in a serviceable main event in that place, and they don't seem to be able to do that as much anymore, and that to me is the biggest deal. So I was a little surprised they didn't scale it back a little bit next year.
Yeah, I think the key words in what you just said are a little bit. I wasn't expecting, well, we're going to be doing 6 pay-per-views and we're going to be doing 25. I was expecting, instead of, what was the number of fight cards? They had 13 pay-per-views and 45.
Yeah.
I was expecting the number to start with a 3, maybe high 3s.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Just scaling it back a little bit to at least address what you're talking about. This was a really tough year for them, and it's not the first time that they've had injuries. I mean, I know this has been worse because it's been headliners, but even when they've had injuries to people that were lower on, say, a main card, it just messes them up terribly. So I was expecting a little bit of a pullback, but we got nothing.
Look, so for example, 2012 wasn't quite as bad as 2014, but it was bad in terms of injuries. Like, people forget that. Mm-hmm. But then things turn around. 2013 was this incredible year of incredible fights, But then 2014 was bad again. I think some people think, I don't know if this is UFC brass, but I think there's a feeling like, okay, 2014's over. We've announced our schedule for 2015. This is all going to be cyclical. But what if it's not? Mm-hmm. What if you have the exact same problem in 2015 that you had in 2014? How do you fill that schedule? I have no answer for that at all. I don't know how you do that.
I tend to believe that as long as the Fox deal, the current Fox deal is in place, it's going to be pretty much this kind of number, because that's what they've sold, right? So I don't expect it to change all that much between now and...
Yeah, but the Fight Pass shows add a lot.
They do. But now that they kind of feel like it's a success, I don't see them pulling the plug on that.
I guess not.
So we'll see. I mean, as you mentioned, 2013 was maybe the best year in UFC history.
It was great.
And I think 2012 was way better than 2014. I mean, you look at 2012, there were some big fights that happened despite all those injuries.
But it was also, remember the same day that the Rampage fight and the Jose fight died on the same day?
Yeah, there was
they got murdered that year too. I just mean, like, how do you create a calendar and you say, okay, serendipity, like, hook us up? What if they have really bad luck again? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Also, knowing the people in charge here who are, they're fighters, right? You want to call them that? They weren't going to pull the plug on this experiment after 1 year.
I'm not saying pull the plug. I'm just saying maybe retool some of it.
Sure.
Maybe you don't have to go back to New Zealand next year. Maybe that can wait.
Final thing on this?
And to Luke's point, that's how they were selling it on Monday in the press conference. Well, we had a bad year, but look at all these fighters. They're all going to fight in the next few months. Maybe.
Let's hope.
Hopefully, fingers crossed, but there's no guarantees.
Well, what about Brock Lesnar? A topic that I really don't like, because it feels like it just keeps going on.
I love talking about
You love?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it just feels like it keeps going on, and everyone's so, they play coy because I think it's good for the discussion, it's good for the UFC to talk about him and all that, but to me, I just always kind of felt like, look, this is a guy who left, he got his ass whooped, he didn't look like himself, he looked like a shell of his former self, he had all these health problems, he's not coming back. Why would he do that? He doesn't even have a team anymore. I mean, his team disbanded. Of course, not the biggest problem. He could get the band back together, but now I'm starting to get the feeling that he might actually come back. Dana White's throwing out some hints. People around him are throwing out some hints. Do you guys actually think that in 2015, 2016, Brock Lesnar comes back? If you would have asked me 6 weeks ago, I would have said no. Even 3 weeks ago. Now, I'm not quite sure. Does anyone want to go out on a limb and say for sure?
I will say this. So
Great. Now I feel a lot better about it.
I'll say this: real fighting does fit his schedule more than the pretend wrestling, because when he was on and I know you like that term,
That's a great term.
When he's working for the WWE, you know, those guys have to go on the road, and because he, I guess, was reluctant to do so, his role there was kind of sketchy. I mean, I don't follow that sports entertainment rules, but it seems as though in order to do something in that environment, you need to be a little bit more of a road warrior, and that's just not his thing. And the idea that he might come out in 2015 and fight a couple fights and train, I mean, sure. I mean, I could see him maybe wanting to do it, but even if the diverticulitis is all gone, he's still, you know, a couple years older than when he's fought before. I mean, you know, it's I don't know. I think a lot of it is going to be, you know, what the ego of the man is. He going to say, well, I can go out there and beat these people, because he did go out, as you said, he went out on a low note. He went out getting whooped by Velasquez and Overeem. So, you know,
I think that MMA is way more difficult, because in pro wrestling, you can do a little training, you go to the gym, but the whole thing is predetermined.
but
Let's
it's
be honest.
It's
He has the best
He
schedule.
only works a few days.
He shows up 4 times a year and beats a guy up, and he doesn't get punched. I mean, this is a guy who.
I mean, it's not real. They don't actually punch them.
I'm sorry to say, you call it pretend. Don't pretend like you don't know. So I don't know about that. But one of the more fascinating stories to watch come next year, once his contract with WWE is up in the spring, man, Bellator. Will they try to make a play? This guy has no ties.
Coker is no fool. He knows big acquisitions matter. The people talking about the
Could you
Fedor
imagine?
expert, I think it'd be huge if they got
him
that.
coming back to any organization is the biggest story of the year by far.
And I think if he does, I think it could rival what Kimbo versus Roy Nelson did on The Ultimate Fighter. About 6 million people. I bet you could do that.
I wonder if MMA has changed since then, but I don't doubt that it would be the highest rated
MMA
show.
has changed, but I think if you captured lightning in a bottle with the right promotion and the right opponent on Spike TV, I think you could definitely.
Brock versus Lashley?
I was going to say that. Yeah.
That's the one.
7-8 million people.
Could you imagine?
But just to be taken seriously here for just a moment, there is a serious story here. Like, if you haven't followed, I don't watch pretend wrestling. I love that. WWE Network. I've been reading about it in the New York Times of all places. It's a really interesting idea and concept. And Vince McMahon's a bold businessman, but it's had a ton of problems in getting the amount of subscribers as for a public company they have promised investors. And then their stock has taken a major hit, and they've lost a ton of money, and they're scaling back. And sure, maybe Lesnar's people in UFC are doing the whole Gina Carano bit, where it's like, is she coming? Is he coming?
Sure.
And you up this person's value. Meanwhile, they have no intention of coming. That could very well be a possibility. But Dave Meltzer has talked about this. Can WWE pay him potentially what UFC could pay him in a year where they really need headliners? And hey, again, you know what? Bellator needs headliners too. And this might be one of those situations where I just feel like Rebney. If one thing that they mentioned was Rebney and Spike kind of butted heads a little bit. I feel like Scott Coker has, you know, hand in glove with Viacom, and so they might be more willing to open the pocketbooks for him in that kind of vision.
Well, look at that set on
Right,
Saturday.
exactly.
Clearly,
I just
they're
don't think
investing.
Rebney could ever. Rebney either didn't believe in it or just couldn't coax it out of him. It seems like Coker can do it, so they might open the pocketbooks for him. And to me, that possibility, who's going to pay Lesnar more, is a real thing. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. A bigger deal for the UFC: return of GSP, return of Brock Lesnar. What would be a bigger deal?
GSP.
Really?
Yeah.
I think Brock Lesnar easy. Brock Lesnar gets everyone talking. The non-MMA fan knows this man. The non-MMA fan cares about it.
GSP's hardly a wallflower.
No, I know that, but Brock Lesnar had this can't miss, you know, like you did not miss a Brock Lesnar fight. I mean, look at the numbers.
I saw. I can't believe I can say this. I watched some of that Undertaker match. God.
Sure you did. The closet fan coming out.
He's like old now. Like he turns like the country of he turns like the color of Country Time lemonade.
Yeah, but that first fight back, which is a bigger deal? I think Brock.
I don't know. Am I wrong?
What do you guys think?
I think maybe that first fight back,
That's what I'm talking about.
Brock, but a long term. I mean,
First fight
GSP.
back.
First fight back.
Does it sort of depend on who the other person is?
Yeah, I think so. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's Brock. Easy answer.
If he goes to UFC though, and let's say if it's him versus Mir, okay, maybe, right?
Right.
But if it's him versus like Stipe or him versus like Roy Nelson, I'm not saying it wouldn't be successful, but
Still Brock.
against GSP headlining
Yeah.
against.
Brock Lesnar, look, I mean, they talk about him all the time. Everyone talks about him. The sports radio stations,
It's true, I agree.
ESPN's
He
always
is
talking
more of a
about him.
crossover. It's almost
He's more,
Rousey-like in the sense that he is a star outside
Do you remember
of his
after
bubble.
UFC 100 when they're talking about him on PTI and all
Yeah,
that
but they're not
stuff?
gonna do that anymore
They won't, but it would get
for the first fight back.
the first
yeah,
fight.
maybe you're right. Maybe you're right.
You're right. Long term, it's
Long
GSP,
term, yeah.
but I think if they need that quick fix, it's Brock Lesnar. Guys, before we go, let's touch on Saturday's main event in Austin. It's Cub Swanson versus Frankie Edgar. A huge fight for the featherweight division, and typically a fight like this between number 2 and 3 would result in the number 1 contender. But there's Conor McGregor out there who is claiming that the UFC is lying to Cub Swanson to his face when they tell him that he is next for a title shot. If Cub does win that fight, does he deserve it? Would it be a crime not to give it to him?
I think it would. I mean, the win streak he's on, how do you not do it? Especially with a guy like Frankie Edgar,
Right.
who you can argue never lost to Ben Henderson. You could argue that, you know. Jose Aldo, I thought he lost that fight, but still, gave him all he could handle for the most part, and then has looked pretty good since. The thing about it is, though, it's like I totally believe that if Cub Swanson wins, they're going to give him that title shot. I would go to my grave saying that. But part of me feels like it's the kiss of death, right? Like they promised a guy a title shot against Frankie Edgar. Like good luck beating that. Good luck beating that kid. Oh, it's a 5-round fight. Yeah, we'll give you a title shot. Meh, good luck. Yeah. And so Conor McGregor sort of in the catbird seat. But but to answer your question, if Cub Swanson wins, how could you possibly deny him?
What about from a business perspective?
Yeah, I
Conor
think
versus Aldo is the bigger fight.
Conor versus Aldo is the bigger fight. That's probably the fight they're going to go with. Should they go with Swanson? I mean, what do they do with Swanson if he beats Edgar? If Swanson beats Edgar and McGregor still gets the title fight against Aldo, who do you have Swanson fight at that point? You just have him wait around? I mean, that's
Well, if the man with the hat was here, he would say...
Nick Lentz.
Of course.
Right.
He deserves that big fight, right?
I'm in his seat, so why don't I say Nick Lentz?
What do you think? Do they do it?
Swanson, yeah. Swanson obviously gets... There's no question that Swanson is the guy that should be the next in line. I actually, I think that Frankie Edgar, even though he did already fight Aldo and went 5 rounds, and it was, wasn't a flash knockout like Swanson's fight against Aldo, but I also think that this fight on Saturday night should determine the next contender. I think that's the challenger should come out of this fight. Now, I do agree though that if it's Edgar, it's going to be a little bit closer between him and McGregor just because of the business side of it, but. Frankie Edgar's a better fighter than
regardless of who wins between Swanson and Edgar on Saturday, I would be stunned if McGregor fought. If he beats Seaver, I'd be stunned if he fought one more time before fighting Aldo.
Yeah, that would be a risk.
I think that if McGregor beats Seaver, his next fight will be Aldo. I don't know if that means Swanson will get the fight, the title before that, but I think that McGregor's next fight after Seaver, if he wins, is definitely Aldo.
And by the way, this is where the rankings may hurt them because it says 2 versus 3. And if you're just watching that, you're like, well, how isn't this a #1 contender fight? Right. If one just fought Chad Mendes, this is where when you have if you didn't have
Carriazo was number 8.
Yeah, but if you didn't have those numbers, it's one less thing to bring up, right?
Sure.
Well, it's another very busy weekend in the world of combat sports. All 3 major MMA promotions aren't in action on Saturday, but you have a really good UFC card. I mean, that main card filled with interesting fights, and then you have Metamoris, which I know you're excited about,
and Copa Podio.
Whatever that is. And you've got Pacquiao versus Algieri. We're excited about that, right?
Long Island.
Right.
Yes.
Undefeated.
Yes. So on Saturday night, you got something for everyone.
It's something Night Raw or something, some kind of fake. No, okay, whatever.
Actually, Survivor Series on Sunday. There you go. It's another great weekend if you're a fan of fighting. We're off for the next couple weeks. It's Thanksgiving next week here in the United States. A couple UFC events coming up, but we will be back. Don't worry, we'll be back in December to talk about who knows. A lot of things, as always, going on in the world of mixed martial arts. Give it up one more time for Mark Ramundi, the newest member of the MMAfighting.com team. He joins us next week. Looking forward to that very much. And now for Luke, Mark, Jeff, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving if you're celebrating next week. And, of course, enjoy the fights this weekend. We'll see you soon.